Welcome to the top 12 highlights of Chapter 5 with Mr. Rodman, here to take you through the top 12 highlights of the American political landscape. Thanks for joining me. Let's start with political efficacy, this idea of being able to know and understand events that are politically motivated and active in order to better understand how to take part in that. So knowing and being able to respond to those events with either support or opposition or taking action, and knowing how to take that action is really what efficacy is all about. This idea of understanding what's happening politically and being able to respond to it. Now, internal efficacy is looking at how we are able to take part, how we are able to write a letter or make a phone call or take our grievances or our complaints to individuals by writing a letter or meeting with them individually, lobbying them on our behalf of our issue. External efficacy is the idea that the government is responding to those issues and those needs when we take our internal efficacy and elevate it to task. So internal is what we are able to know and understand about politics and how it works and how and what they should actually take part in. And then external efficacy is how the government responds. And in some cases, government responds really well. And in other cases, we have like Hurricane Katrina, in which government didn't respond well. And so the people are like, what is going on? Why is this such a problem? So that's really the differences in terms of internal and external efficacy. The idea of being able to respond to citizens is really what government is all about, is being able to take our needs in terms of what we believe government should do. Again, going back to that political culture, government should help us to restore liberty. How do we do that? Well, that becomes an ideological issue. But the fact that government should be involved is part of that political culture. And political efficacy, internal efficacy, is how we believe we should take our ideology and use that in a political setting. And then how government responds to it would definitely be the external efficacy that we've seen there. So do you think Americans have higher internal or external efficacy? The idea is that unfortunately we don't do a lot of responding to those needs. We see politically active ones, and especially when issues really come to the fore, it's because of something that has really set us off. But more often than not, we tend to ignore it as noise. And until something rises to the level of being a major problem, we don't particularly see it as such. Now, demographics. These are labels. Quite simply, they're population characteristics, but they're labels. We put labels on things all the time. We have labels on clothes. We have labels on food. We have labels on furniture. If you look at the back, you can see, a label of where it was made and that kind of thing. And we do this to people all the time, putting them in buckets, putting them in categories. That's what demographics basically are. Now, we generalize for the purpose of political efficacy to be able to understand how people are going to know and take part in their government. But this demographics tells us a lot about what we call their reinforcing cleavages. Will they vote a certain way? Will they donate? Will they respond? Will they volunteer? And demographics tell us a lot about this. Now, keep in mind, political socialization. We get a lot of this, the need to take part in something or not to take part because of socialization, our family being first and foremost. But they get that background from those demographics. So generally we can see that certain individuals will respond in certain ways based on their demographics. And it's not saying everybody falls into that category, certainly not under age, race, gender, or income, or education, that matter, or where they're from in the country. But the idea is we can get a general sense of where they are, and that's the reinforcing cleavage we're talking about here. So, for example, here we have a white Protestant male that is going to vote a certain way, that is very religious and tends to vote conservatively, probably going to vote Republican, probably going to be pretty adamant about voting and making sure that they do so. And that's a reinforcing cleavage. Now, if we were to say that this person was a white Protestant male, but highly educated and lived in an urban setting and believed in same-sex marriage but not in the right to an abortion, there's some cross-cutting cleavage going on there, and that's what we see here. we have an example of a cross-cutting cleavage in which we really can't tell based on what their characteristics or their demographics are. These are cross-cutting cleavages. It crosses the ideological line and creates cleavages in lots of different ways. So it's really hard to tell how they're going to vote. They may tend to be more conservative. They may tend to be more liberal. We really don't know. And these are the voters that drive pollsters crazy, because when you're working on a campaign, trying to figure out whether people are going to show up to the polls or not, and hey, do I pick up these 5 people or these 5 people? I'm trying to figure out demographically which one can I rely on as a reliable voter in order to take to the polls. That's where cross-cutting cleavages aren't your friend. Reinforcing cleavages are going to give you a much better picture of what reliable voters that you have. Now, de Tocqueville talks in this chapter about democracy in America. Why was it so successful? There's lots of reasons. We can say it's because of the North American landscape, the idea that it's separated from the rest of the world by oceans and really is able to defend its borders as such. It also had a lot of fertile resources, which then could be used to make food, and trees to make with natural resources to make the buildings and the houses and things to create communities. There's lots of economic independence and individual spirit that really drives it. But the idea of that economic individualism and that entrepreneurial spirit is really what gave us this idea of American exceptionalism. What we have is like no other. It is a love of country, a love of working together and being a part of something that is greater than you, and doing something for the common good that's going to help many people down the road. And de Tocqueville, in his time here, who was going to actually write a book about the correctional institutions of the time, was really coming to America to look at our correctional facilities, our prisons, if you will, the penal colony of the penal institutions, of the colonies at the time, and really found it much more fascinating than he ever thought he would, which really led to this book, Democracy in America, the idea of the right climate for a democratic government, and the spirit and the individual nature of people to work together for the common good. It was just something that was so unique and really created that American exceptionalism. Now, one thing to note here, in terms of the last election, talking about that fertile soil and changes and people moving around, you can see this will change with the 2020 census, but in the 2010 census, we can see some states picked up, especially in the Sun Belt and in the South, picked up some seats. I mean, look at Florida and Texas, each picking up 2 and 4 respectively. That means that you had to have more growth over and above many other states, and that's incredible in terms of growth. Shows you that the Rust Belt up here near the Great Lakes really lost a lot of seats. You saw 2 lost in Ohio, 2 in New York, 1 in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Jersey. So losing a lot of seats there also shows the demographic shifts, or the population shifts, the population shifts from one place to another. And that really has quite an impact in terms of the differences that it makes there. And we see those regional differences all the time. We look at different election results by country, by county, by state, and we can see that there's still a lot of red. Even in President Obama's election, the electoral victory that he had over John McCain, you can see county by county, which is why this isn't necessarily always a good indicator. But you see county by county, the red in the states. Maryland, for instance, a lot of geographically very red, with bright blue or dark blue contingents in Baltimore and Montgomery County that really drives up the vote there. And that makes all the difference in the world. So a lot of demographics that we wouldn't normally think about when we think of, wow, this was the Obama election. This was the election of America's first black president. And as you can see, there's lots of blue in those urban centers and things in just the right places to make a difference. But the map geographically and demographically can be different, and it all comes down to the Electoral College, as we know from the 2016 election. So again, demographics in terms of urban versus rural. Suburban voters really going to be the vote to capture in the 2020 election. Looking at the suburban voter, how are they going to vote? Because they're very cross-cutting. cross-cutting. Suburban voters are very cross-cutting cleavages. It's hard to know how they're going to vote. Urban voters, yes, they're going to vote more liberal. Rural, they're going to vote more conservative. But suburban, that's really where elections are going to be won or lost. And we see that a huge difference in terms of what we've seen across the country. We can see in the Rust Belt in the South, the Sun Belt too, very conservative, as well as the Midwest, the Rust Belt area, and more liberal in the Northeast and the West Coast, kind of the coasts and areas in between. Major urban centers would be a big difference there. And we see the urban centers being more liberal, where the rural, much more conservative. In terms of race, African Americans definitely have a strong voting pattern, one of the strongest, and they do vote Democratic like 90% of the time. And again, we're generalizing, doesn't mean all African Americans vote democratically, but President Obama in 2008 got 95% of the African American vote. That's huge. That's a huge turnout. And by the way, that's also what was lacking in 2016, which is what led to some of the really hard-fought places. The turnout by African Americans and Hispanic voters in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio really was tough to overcome for Clinton in the Clinton v. Trump race. So we break these down and can look and see quite a few disparities here. We know that Hispanics and Latinos and African Americans tend to vote more Democratic. Remember, Cuban Americans tend to vote more conservatively in that space, and then white voters. There's a mix. It is cross-cutting, but women tend to vote more liberally. White men tend to vote more conservatively as a result of that. The Latin American vote, the Hispanic vote here, less monolithic, as I mentioned, with Cuban Americans voting more conservatively, as well as other Latinos voting more liberally. But the idea here, again, in the 2008 race, we saw President Obama get about 2/3 of the Hispanic vote. Really huge, and turnout makes such a big difference. As I mentioned in the 2016 election, turnout is so key in some of these places. It's really critical that you get the vote out, and getting the vote out, urging people to come to the polls. Many cases, taking the elderly and others to the polls really could make a difference. And when you need just a few thousand votes, that really can make or break a state in terms of its electoral victory or loss. Asian Americans, this is a little more refined. We see that Japanese Americans more likely to be Democrats than others. We see more Korean, Chinese tend to be more conservative in that respect. And I think it also comes down to some income and education levels as well. So it depends on their political participation. You may see younger voters that are Korean or Chinese that are very liberal. You may see, younger Japanese voters that are more conservative. It's not generalizing entirely, but we're trying to at least make some estimations based on the data that we see here. And income and education levels obviously are very high in terms of political participation. When we see, higher income tend to vote more conservatively, lower income. The idea here is that they would vote more conservatively in the lower income brackets, depending on their region, because it's a lot broken down by region. Even though they may get government programs, they don't necessarily always see the government as being the help that they need. And then we get on to religious differences, religious diversity based on these regional differences. We see Democratic, more liberal Catholics and Jewish people tend to vote more democratically or more liberally, where we see Protestants are voting more Republican. They tend to vote more conservatively in that regard. And then again, this isn't always an indicator, but the idea is that higher participation we see with Jewish people voting 90% of the time in some of these elections of note more recently, and those with no affiliation also voting 60% of the time. Obviously, making sure that their vote counts even more so than they may have. Maybe they're not a member of a party. Maybe they're more cross-cutting in their cleavages. But the idea is that they do tend to turn out and do vote even though they are not affiliated. So 60%, wow, that's 6 in 10 that would make that happen. And then here's the breakdown of the demographics by religious persuasion or influence that we see there. Looking at gender, a huge gap in gender. We see women voting more liberally, men voting more conservatively, and that gap has pretty much stayed over the last 30 years or so in terms of those differences. Lastly, we get to the demographics, looking at the family. The demographic of the family has changed. We have a lot more, one-parent households, mixed households, multi-generational households that we see. Also, education that can have an impact. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to politically participate in voting and in a campaign or donating to a campaign or joining an interest group, that type of thing. Your wealth, obviously we've talked about that in terms of higher levels of participation, the more that individuals make. And they do tend to vote more conservatively. So the Citizens United case, incorporating money into elections in unlimited amounts by corporations and unions, definitely had an impact. And we see that with the emergence of Michael Bloomberg, even with joining the 2020 race, in which many people in the Democratic Party are decrying, why is he here? He's not really a Democrat. But he has a lot of money that he has donated through the years to different individuals, and really sees that as part of favors to call in, and we'll see how he does in looking at the upcoming primary races. But wealth and income, definitely you can't deny that they do have an impact here, and especially since that Citizens United case, the last 10 years have really kind of changed up the political game there. Social class, well, as we know, we're not very class oriented. We're more economic individualistic. But we do tend to see, if you're looking at that class based on income, we see the impact that it has. And then we also know that older voters, they're going to vote to the polls. They're making a day of it. They're doing it with their friends, getting on the bus at the retirement community in order to go vote. They have a lot of influence in politics today because of the fact that they can be reliably counted upon to vote, come out to vote. They do it religiously, and as we know, older voters tend to be more conservative in nature. They also see less government in that capacity, except for with the exceptions of Social Security, because it's something they paid into, not necessarily a government program, which tends to be their viewpoint and their perspective. And we finished the chapter kind of going back to what we talked about in the beginning, this idea of we have values as part of our political culture that we see here: liberty, equality, democracy, individual responsibility. How we carry that out is where we get into the ideological beliefs, the different perspectives that we hold dear. But going back to de Tocqueville and this idea of those political values, those cultural values that shape us, we have that economic opportunity, that economic individualism, also that work hard mindedness, that idea of being very entrepreneurial and seeking out the American dream. Everybody having that idea of that 2.5 kids and a picket fence and all that good stuff. We really share those values. Everybody wants them. How we go about getting them is a different story. And by the way, it's a euphemism. The idea of the picket fence and 2.5 kids. Obviously, nobody has 2.5 kids, and nobody has. I don't have a white picket fence. But the idea is that the American dream is about that ideal of what home should be, what family looks like for you, and the idea that in America you can reach those dreams of whatever it is you want it to be and however you want to make it. That's really the critical piece here. Education, economics, social mobility, all of those things give us the tools to be able to be the next Google guy, to be the next Steve Jobs and create the next iPhone. All of those things are possible because of these values that we hold dear. Well, I hope you found this helpful in this chapter, and good luck on the upcoming quiz, test, or exam. Live the 5. You'll do your best. Forget the rest. Take care.